Today, we're diving deep into what is honestly one of the most high-stakes dynamics in any society. We're talking about that fragile and often super contentious boundary between your individual constitutional rights and the sheer immense power of the government. You can kind of think of the government's power like a sword. It's absolutely necessary for maintaining order and fighting crime, right? But it's also incredibly dangerous if it's swung wildly. So, to protect us, the legal system provides a shield. But how strong is that shield really? And what actually happens when the government tries to pierce right through it?
Okay, I want you to put yourself in this scenario for a second. Imagine you're a lawyer. The government comes knocking on your door and says, look, we're going to prosecute you, seize your assets, and potentially throw you in prison. But there's a way out. All you have to do is give us the name of your client. Wow, it is the absolute ultimate test of loyalty. Do you save your own skin, or do you protect the person who placed their ultimate total trust in you? Well, this isn't just some hypothetical question. It's the exact real-world dilemma at the very heart of our main anchor case today, the landmark 1996 case of Regala versus Sandiganbayan.
Section 1. The Ultimate Legal Ultimatum. Regala versus Sandiganbayan.
Okay, let's dive into this timeline to really see how the pressure mounted. The context here is this massive, incredibly high-profile hunt by the Philippine government for alleged ill-gotten wealth. They were specifically tracking down coconut levy funds. So the state, acting through the Presidential Commission on Good Government, or the PCGG, was determined to catch the bigger fish operating in this sprawling corporate network. And to do that, they turned their sights directly on the lawyers who helped set up those corporations. In 1987, the PCG files a complaint against a principal defendant, Eduardo Coajanco Jr., along with several elite lawyers from the ACCRA law firm, alleging they conspired to build this network. By 1988, the PCG offers the lawyers a deal. Hey, we'll drop you from this massive lawsuit if you just tell us who you are acting as nominees for. Fast forward to 1992, and the Sandiganbayan, a special appellate court, denies the lawyers' request to be excluded from the case because they flat out refused to comply with the PCG's condition. Finally, the clock is ticking, and in 1996, the Supreme Court has to step in to resolve this massive standoff.
The stakes here get crystal clear when we contrast how different lawyers handled this intense pressure. Take Raul Rocco, for example, who was initially a co-defendant. The PCGG was satisfied that Rocco demonstrated his agency and apparently identified his principal. And because he complied, boom, dropped from the complaint entirely. But then we have the ACCRA lawyers. They took what the lower court actually called a heroic stance. They adamantly, stubbornly refused to identify their clients. They held their ground, even as they stared down the barrel of severe conspiracy charges alongside the principal defendants.
Section 2. The Attorney-Client Shield. Protecting the fiduciary duty.
So, you might be wondering, how on earth could these lawyers justify withholding information from a massive government corruption investigation? Well, they invoked one of the most sacred foundational principles in the entire legal profession, the absolute sanctity of the attorney-client privilege. This is actually the oldest privilege for confidential communications known to common law. It exists for one primary reason: to protect the fiduciary duty and the absolute trust between a lawyer and their client. It literally prevents the state from forcing a lawyer to become a weapon against the very person they've sworn to defend. Think about it. Without this privilege, our adversarial justice system simply couldn't function. No one would ever feel safe being entirely honest with their own legal counsel.
However, and this is a big however, it's vital to note that this shield is not entirely impenetrable. In a really powerful dissenting opinion, Justice Puno argued that the privilege is not some magic mantra you can just say out loud to make your legal problems disappear. There are rare exceptions where the identity of a client actually must be revealed. For instance, if disclosing the name establishes the client's direct connection to the crime, or if the client is entirely unknown, or if revealing the name provides the necessary link for the prosecution to build its case where none otherwise exists. And the state? They argued hard that these exceptions applied perfectly to the ACCRA lawyers.
But the Supreme Court ultimately disagreed with the state. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the court's rock-solid commitment to the privilege. Just listen to this slam-dunk quote from the majority decision. Compelling disclosure of the client's name amounts to sanctioning fishing expeditions by lazy prosecutors and litigants, which we cannot and will not countenance. I mean, wow, the court firmly ruled that the state cannot just use a defendant's own lawyer as a convenient shortcut to build their case. The state's sword was completely blocked, the lawyer's shield held up, and they were dropped from the case.
Section 3. Protecting the private sphere. The shield against unreasonable searches.
You know, the shield of law doesn't just protect the secrets you tell your lawyer, it heavily protects your physical space as well. Get this number, 42. That is the sheer number of search warrants issued on different dates against businessman Harry Stonehill, his associates, and their corporations in another landmark case. The state was trying to seize massive amounts of personal property, documents, and records. It was a dragnet. But the court struck down this unwarranted state intrusion. They relied heavily on Fourth Amendment principles from the U.S. Constitution, which dictate that warrants must be incredibly specific and based on solid probable cause. General warrants that just allow the government to rummage freely through your life, totally illegal.
And let me tell you, this protection is incredibly strict, even when the state finds something that is undeniably, truly dangerous. Take the case of Sami Malakat. Police literally seized a live grenade from him. But the Supreme Court ruled that the grenade was completely inadmissible as evidence in court. Why? Because the search wasn't incidental to a lawful arrest, and it wasn't a valid stop and frisk. So without a lawful justification, the state's sword absolutely cannot pierce the shield of privacy. The evidence gets thrown out no matter how incredibly incriminating it is.
Section 4, the private citizen loophole, when the shield doesn't apply. Now, what's really interesting about this is there's a pretty surprising twist to these constitutional protections. The shield doesn't actually protect you from everyone. We have to make a very stark distinction between state action and private action. The Bill of Rights, including that strict protection against unreasonable searches we just talked about, is a restraint specifically directed at the government and its law enforcement agencies. It is not a restraint on private individuals. If the police want to search your bag, they absolutely need a warrant or probable cause. But if your neighbor or a private business owner decides to snoop through your belongings on their own initiative, those constitutional protections simply do not apply.
Let's look at exactly how this plays out in the fascinating case of People v. Marty. So, Andre Marty goes to a forwarding agency to ship 4 packages to Zurich. He tells them it's just books, cigars, and gloves. While the proprietor, Job Reyes, following his own standard operating procedure, opens the boxes for a final inspection after Marty leaves. And what does he find? Dried marijuana leaves, hidden right inside the gloves. Reyes immediately calls the National Bureau of Investigation, who rush over and seize the evidence. Because Job Reyes was a private citizen acting completely on his own without any government instruction, the Supreme Court ruled the search was not unconstitutional. That marijuana? Perfectly admissible in court. Crazy, right?
Section 5. Preserving system integrity. Holding the state accountable. So why the double standard? The reason the law creates such a heavy shield against the state but not against private citizens is simply because the state possesses the immense, terrifying power to legally deprive you of your life, liberty, and property. Because of that, the law demands absolute, meticulous integrity when the state exercises that power. Let's move over to a drug case to see how this builds in practice. When police conduct a buy-bust operation, there's a very strict sequence they absolutely must follow. After an informant tip in the operation itself, the seizure of illegal drugs, like shabu, triggers a mandatory, unbelievably strict chain of custody. The state has to prove exactly who handled the evidence at every single moment to establish the corpus delicti, or the body of the crime. There can be no gaps, none. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens when the state fumbles those procedures. In the case of Zaida Kamad, the accused was completely acquitted and released. Why? Because the court found flagrant procedural lapses by the police in handling the seized shabu. They were super obvious gaps in the chain of custody, which created serious doubts about the origins of the evidence they actually presented in court. The standard presumption of regularity that we usually give to police work, that goes right out the window if the state deviates from the strict standard of official duty required by law. But hey, accountability isn't just for the police. It's for the courts themselves. 1 million pesos. That was the amount an executive assistant at the Court of Appeals, Elvira Cruz Apapo, actually solicited from a litigant in exchange for a speedy and favorable decision. She was caught dead to rights in a presidential anti-organized crime task force entrapment operation. The Supreme Court swiftly dismissed her for dishonesty and grave misconduct. It proves that to maintain the shield of justice, the judiciary has to relentlessly purge its own bad eggs, who peddle influence and destroy public trust.
Section 6, the price of justice, the burden of freedom.
We've seen just how strict these legal rules are today. Lawyers legally keeping secrets from corruption investigators. Live grenades and drugs being thrown out as evidence just due to procedural errors. It can seem incredibly frustrating from the outside looking in. So why do we tolerate this? Well, it comes down to a really delicate balancing act. As Justice Puno noted in his dissent back in the Regala case, there is a massive tension here. On one hand, truth is the absolute touchstone of justice. The courts literally need the truth to function properly.
But on the other hand, our adversary system of justice requires broad privileges and strict protections to prevent the state from mutating into a tyrannical force.
So the crucial point is this. The rules are built this way entirely by design. Lawyers must protect their clients to ensure everyone actually has a defense. The state cannot search your home without cause to ensure your fundamental privacy. Police must follow exact procedures so evidence isn't fabricated or tampered with. And courts must remain incorruptible so the final judgment is actually fair. These rules, as frustrating as they can be, are the individual components that forge the ultimate shield against state overreach.
Which leaves us with a final, somewhat provocative thought. When a lawyer stays silent, or when undeniable evidence is thrown out on a technicality, it often means someone who genuinely committed a crime might walk away completely free. But without those strict rules binding the government's sword, not a single one of us would be safe from arbitrary state power. So you really have to ask yourself, does protecting the guilty sometimes mean protecting us all? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning and keep questioning.